tonight we have a very special presentation for you. One person is the acclaimed director of such films as Gremlins, The Howling, and the other is responsible for the fantasy worlds of George Pal and the restoration of the Puppetoon movies. Please welcome Joe Dante and Arnold Leibovit. I've got a couple of questions for you guys. If you want to just answer a few things, I'm sure the folks are just dying to know. So, Joe, I just want to ask you, what do you remember about the very first time you saw a George Pal movie?
Well, I'm afraid my answer isn't very sexy.
Well, then we'll just move on to the next question.
Because the first George Pal movie I ever saw was The Great Rupert, which is the first movie that he ever made, first live-action movie he made after doing the Puppetoons, which starred Jimmy Durante and a stop-motion squirrel. And it's a very cute movie. It's now public domain, so you can get terrible copies of it everywhere. But it was a very nice movie, and I was a Puppetoon fan before that, and I was sort of interested to see what he would do live action. Then, of course, the next picture I saw from George Pal was Destination Moon, which was part of a two-picture deal that he had with this small company. And the thing about Destination Moon was it was scrupulously accurate for the time as an example of what we were going to expect when we went into outer space. And he had all the scientists and all the designs and stuff were all based on real stuff. And the only disappointment I had when I was a kid was that I saw the movie, but they got to the moon, there were no monsters. So I was very disappointed there were no monsters. But I do remember when the first spacewalk actually happened and we got to see it on TV. To me, it looked exactly like the spacewalk in Destination Moon. So I think Pal was really ahead of his time.
And Arnold, I'd like to ask you a question about the Puppetoons. What went into creating the animation using the Puppetoons? Can you tell us a bit how that was done?
The Puppetoons are astonishing. George Pal created a system of animation that had never been done before, and you're about to see it. It was called the replacement figure puppet, meaning that for every frame of film, imagine this, there's a separate puppet part made of wood or puppet was replaced for every single frame of film. So it's not like you had a single armature like you had, say, with King Kong that was manipulated. This was done with replacement figure puppets. So there could be 12,000 individual frames, hundreds of heads and body parts and walking and talking and eyeballs, and it was all replaced, one frame at a time. So when you watch the Puppetoons, you have to imagine what that was like. It was using practical effects. We're not talking about CGI, we're not doing any kind of modern effects. It was all done by hand and craft. It was all craft, which is what George specialized in when he was starting his early years of special effects. And so War of the Worlds is also in that arena because George called it puppetry on a grand scale. So there's elements of War of the Worlds that the Puppetoons are reflective of that George did. So there are many stories along those lines, but the main thing you want to pay attention to is the style, the look, the beauty, the simplicity, the charm of the Puppetoon.
So, Joe, what was it like when you saw your very first Puppetoon?
Well, I was a big cartoon fan anyway, and my experience with the Puppetoons was obviously on television because they weren't running theatrically when I was a kid. And frankly, the prints often were not the best. And I have to say that the restoration work that Arnie has done on these films it's a gift to cinema. I mean, these are really important films that would have languished. And you know, now we have very strict feelings about what we think is a good restoration. And these are top-notch. I mean, these look as good or better than they did when they came out of the lab. And I think it's all because of Arnie.
Thank you, Arnie.
Thank you.
And by the way, could you tell us about the music that's used? Because the music is a big element in Puppetoons.
That's a tremendous question. George was a master of use of music. He really understood music. He came from Europe when he did these originally. and he worked with all the big bands in Europe, DeBroy Summers, and many of the other large, Jack Hilton in his orchestra was another one that he worked with over Europe, and he really understood the use of music. I would say the music identifies the Puppetoons more than anything else in how he incorporated music with special effects and the charm of the stories. When he came to the United States, he had Andre Kostelanetz working, which is no small matter. It was a pretty big name. And David Raxon, who did the music for Laura, won an Academy Award for that, was the first Puppetoon. And you're about to see Western Days that hasn't been seen on a movie screen in 85 years and restored like never before from the original successive negatives that Paramount has been graciously allowing me to restore. It's unlike anything you've ever seen before. And I'm really excited for all of you to be able to see this. It's almost a revelation. And
It is a revelation.
I hope so.
Yeah.
I hope it's a revelation for those. So that's a big part. So the musical element is in all of these films, and I think that's what really carries the films. And I think you'll enjoy that with every one of these. There's Duke Ellington with Date with Duke. He worked with Woody Herman. He worked with Louis Armstrong. He worked with Peggy Lee. All the great performers of the day are all involved in the Puppetoons. So, great question.
Well, thank you. And now, after the Puppetoons, there's going to be an intermission, and then we're going to have War of the Worlds. How many people have never seen War of the Worlds 1953? Oh, well, everybody's already seen it. We can just go home.
But not on the big screen.
Not on a giant screen. The giant theater screen right here, that's a big, enormous screen, ladies and gentlemen. And we have a wonderful version of it. It's the 4K restoration from Paramount, and Arnold wants to say something.
It's the 71st anniversary of War of the Worlds. And here we are, 71 years later, watching this incredible film. It moves, the incredible sense of timing, the direction of this film. It's almost perfection. It's what I call a miracle movie, because all the disparate parts came together in this movie like none other. And there's so much work and craft that went into this film that had never been done before. In the history of cinema, this was the forerunner, and as even Joe has talked about, it's really the seminal film of the 1950s. It truly is, and it influenced everything that's come since for so many reasons. And I'm sure Joe has much to say about it.
Well, I've actually already said it. There's a commentary track that I did with Bill Warren a couple of years ago for a DVD, which goes into voluminous detail, more than you probably want to even hear. But the thing about this movie is that it's so well produced, and it was so unusual at that time for science fiction movies to be given this kind of, quality. And what they did is the Paramount said, okay, well, we'll give George enough money to make the picture correctly, but no movie stars, because that'll cost too much money. So, which turned out to be an okay idea, because the picture is filled with character actors, all of whom we will recognize from years and years of watching Perry Mason and every other TV show that was on in the 50s. And they're all Cracker Jack people, and you'll recognize them from hundreds of movies, and they're all good. And it's technically a really marvelous movie, and the effort that went into it is really second to none. There were very, very few other movies, including Forbidden Planet and This Island Earth, that ever approached the level of craft that this picture shows.
And Joe, while you're still on the mic, you worked with George Pal. You met him, didn't you?
I wish I could say that, but no, I did not. I never met George, but I felt like I knew him, because the movies of his that I loved, which included The Time Machine, which Rod Taylor told me was one of the favorite movies he ever did. The thing about that movie that is different from the other versions of that story is that George has a lot of heart, and the thing about his movies is that they're all movies with a heart. They're not just exercises in special effects. They're always about something.
And Arnie, you worked with George Pal.
George was the most wonderful man I've ever met in my life. I've had three top heroes in my life. It was George, Ray Harryhausen, and Walt Disney, and I got to meet and know all of them. More Ray than Walt. George. And I was friends with George for a time until he passed away. And then I was a long-term friend with Mrs. Pal for 25 years. And George was, everyone loved George. There wasn't anyone that I know that I worked with me. I talked to everyone that worked with George, including Rod Taylor and Tony Curtis and Janet Leigh and Alan Young. Everyone that worked with George loved him. He was he had a wonderful self-effacing quality about him. He opened himself up to people. He let them have their space. He let them have their way. Tony Randall told me that George was one of nature's noblemen. He was a true, gentle man. Tony Curtis said, you couldn't help but want to work for George. You couldn't help but want to please George. Anne, who worked with George, has many wonderful things to say because it's really Mrs. Pal that helped her get the role for War of the Worlds. And he helped so many people in the industry. That's the other thing that's so important. He gave a leg up to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people in the motion picture industry. And he made known stars like Charlton Heston and Tony Curtis's first picture, which was Houdini, and many other well-known actors and actresses and technicians in the industry, people that work in the industry. George was responsible for he was called the father of the modern science fiction and fantasy film. So my feelings about George run very deep, very deep. When he passed away, it touched me terribly. And I told Mrs. Pal, I said, we need to do something for George. We need to attribute to him, to his life. And that's when I made the film on George Pal, the Fantasy Film Awards, which we're going to show. I'm doing a restoration of it, and it's going to show again. And then I did the Puppetoon movie. But it's all George. It's because of George and his genius, the genius of George Pal. And it's every second, every piece that you see on the screen, especially the Puppetoons, is George Pal from every single frame. And that's the important part, really.
Thank you, Arnold. That's very interesting and touching about George. And tonight's series is the first of many screenings we're going to do featuring George. It's part of the Flights of Fantasy Film Festival. And right now, we're going to clear the stage, and then we're going to start with our first show will be the Puppetoons, a brief intermission, then War of the Worlds. Thanks again, Joe, Dante, and Arnold Leibovit. And thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Starting forward, just the people.